terribly big. So it's an experiment. This is saved as a PDF to try. This is a really, in some ways, a follow-on from Duncan's talk that he had a couple of weeks ago, where he was talking about the military roads. And I'm going to talk about Thomas Telford and his contribution to the communication networks. And focusing, as Roland said, I was asked to talk about the Kyle of Sutherland and work that's been done there.
Susan, can I just pause you? At the moment, we can see quite a small image, and yet there's a whole screen to look at. If you look along your top line, you've got something called 78%. If you click on that.
I don't have that. I don't have it. I don't have a Zoom screen that gives me any.
No, it's your Adobe screen, your PDF screen. And
oh yes, okay, yep, I'm with you. Do it 100%.
If you go down to 100%, if you click on that again, you can get that's great. And then at top right, if you maximize, if you go to full screen,
is that better?
Thank you so much. That's great.
No problem. So why Telford? Well, Art was trying to look for a project that would actually be applicable to most of the Highlands. And Thomas Telford immediately came to mind because he, in fact, was influential in almost every aspect, every area of the Highlands. So he also, I think, arguably changed the course of the Highlands. And for that reason alone, I think he deserves, and his work deserves to be better known. Just a bit of biography about him. He was born in 1757. He was a civil engineer. He was, obviously came from fairly low parentage, but he got a patron and he had training. But he was one of these polymaths as well. He was not only a civil engineer, but he was a poet. And he had other aspects to him. He was employed in the 1790s by the British Fisheries Society to inspect harbours. And then his big breakthrough, certainly for the Highlands, was in 1803 to 4. He became the engineer for the parliamentary commissioners to make roads and bridges throughout the Highlands. It's hard to believe, given his impact here in the Highlands, that Scotland and indeed the Highlands was only one small area he worked on. He's obviously well known for his work in Wales, but he also worked in Sweden. He was consulted by the Canadians. He had really a vast influence worldwide. And he, born 1757, died 1834. In the Highlands here, he was responsible for over 100 bridges, both in stone and iron, and we'll come to the iron one in a moment. Almost 1,000 miles of new roads. He also did canals. We all know about the Caledonian Canal. Some of us have actually looked and looked at his other canal, which is the Dingwall Canal. He was responsible for a lot of harbors, for piers, for slipways. Really lots to do with communication. But he also, in the 1820s, started getting involved with the parliamentary churches and was responsible for building churches and manses. And he was responsible for building towns. Pulteney Town in Wick is a Telford design. He planned another one on Skye that only had a couple of buildings that got built, but he had this vast influence in the Highlands. He was also innovative. Some of his major innovations include the locks on the Caledonian Canal, which was considered amazing at the time. The mound up near Golspie, which really deserves a lot more attention, where it separated a sea loch from a freshwater loch with its elaborate system of pulleys and winches. And of course his iron bridges. And we'll talk about the Bonar Bridge Iron Bridge in a bit. So what was different about Telford than what had gone on before? When Duncan was speaking a couple of weeks ago, a month ago, probably now, Duncan, he talked about military roads, and obviously they had a separate remit. They were designed to link between their barracks, to link aspects there, and being military, it was slightly different in terms of budgeting. Telford, for his time, was incredibly different in that he put his work out to tender. And he inspected the work as it was being done and sometimes rejected it. We have his notebooks where he'll sometimes say this bit needs to be redone. He had a budget, and most of the time he kept to it. He was very good at delegating. And if you put these together, what you come up with is not so much a civil engineer as a modern project manager. and he was a project manager par excellence. And you can see this in the task he did. But he was also technically capable. So his road design, for example, for the Highlands, it had to have drainage because otherwise it was pointless. I mean, that was one of the problems with the military roads, that they did not have very good drainage. And in fact, Telford repaired most of the military roads that were in the Highlands. The road design was also there for cattle and was also for carriages. So he knew that the roads up here in the Highlands were not just going to be for people transporting, it was for the droving as well. For his work in the Kyle of Sutherland, and indeed for his work all throughout the Highlands, there are a couple main sources to look at. His autobiography is full of amazing detail. It's a mixture of factual detail and his notebook on how much stress a masonry bridge of such a size can take. It also has an atlas with lots of drawings. There's a copy of this in Inverness Library, and when that eventually opens, if you haven't seen it, I suggest you go in and ask to get it from behind the stacks. The atlas in particular, it's enormous. It's the size of, well, I don't know, it's huge. It's huge. They regularly lose it at the library, so if they say they don't have it, tell them they do have it, and they'll go back and find it. We also have the parliamentary commissioners' reports. These were the people in charge of the project. And so we get reports every 2 years, sometimes every year, and they give you an ongoing story about what's happening with the works, what are the problems, and you can see the whole project developing throughout the Highlands. We also have a number of archives, many of them in Highland Council, that gives the other half of the story, which is what council is doing while the parliamentary roads are being there. The statistical accounts are excellent for this because we have the old statistical account in the late 1700s, which gives us a nice snapshot about what it was like before Telford. And then we have the new statistical account, which is usually about the 1830s or 1840s, which gives us then an account of what happened afterwards. So by comparing and contrasting, we can get a lot of detail. Lots of information from old maps. And of course, there's a wealth of books. Some of them are secondary sources, some of them are more primary. One of my favorites is Robert Southey, who was a poet at the time and a friend of Telford, who did a journal and a journey of a tour in Scotland in 1819. I'll be quoting a few things because it's a wonderful book of somebody looking from the outside about Telford's work. So what was it like before Telford? Well, the roads, there were roads in the Highlands. The map I'm showing is one that Duncan showed. This shows Avery's mapping about the Wade roads. And we can see coming down here, a road that goes over the Stourey, that basically goes from Eventon down to the Kyle of Sutherland. And so there was a road there before Telford did it, but these weren't roads in the sense that we think of roads. They weren't ones that you could take a carriage on. And the quote there is from Telford writing, not in 1928, 1828, about a journey that he had in Sutherland 20 years earlier. It was with difficulty that I could scramble along rugged, broken, sandy, short or narrow tracks on the edge of precipice, frequently interrupted by rude and inconvenient ferries. I mean, basically, it was not an easy communications before. There was also a lot of ferries, as he mentioned, and a lot of fording there. In the area we're talking about, there was the two big ferries, which are Mickle Ferry and Little Ferry, going over, one goes over the Dornoch Firth, the other is going between Gulspie. As we can see, here's the one going up that way. These were heavily used and very dangerous. And just while they were doing the planning of the routes up here in this area, we had the Mickle Ferry disaster where over 100 people were killed. And this has a lot of impact on what Telford did. There were also other ferries. We had a ferry at Bonner Bridge, before the bridge, had a ferry. In Verschin had a ferry, a couple other ferries up that way as well. We get information about people doing these crossings in various types of boats, yawls, cobbles, that talk about fording and swimming cattle across them. Before Telford as well, we were talking about two of the parishes in the Highlands. They're two, but they're huge, absolutely huge. And there was no way that a lot of the parishioners could get to the main parish church. Preaching stations, the old statistical accounts tell us about preaching stations and about missionary ministers, but it was a real issue about how you got your population able to get to church. So Telford's roads in the Kyle of Sutherland, it was a design that was basically, there was a lot of wrangling at the start. There was a lot of where they were going to go, where they were going to do the crossings, and the key was how they were going to cross over the Dornoch Firth. At the first bit, they were going to build a ferry. They were going to come at the mid-ferry, coming there and cross there. This is Bonar Bridge up here. We're going to cross over at this area there and then go on, and then they were going to cross over to Little Ferry and go up and cross over to Golspie that way. And so they were going to link it with various different roads, the Tane Road that would link in, the Fearn Road coming across the Struy. Over this way would take us up to Tongue and going towards through up to Lairg and up to Tongue, and the Skibo Road that would take us up that way. But there were changes as they went, and as I say, the Mickle Ferry was key to that. Originally, as I said, they were going to go from Creek to Little, they were going to go from Creek, but once they decided to build a bridge at Bonar Bridge, then of course they had to move over the roads over to that, and then build it back on the other side of the Firth, on the north side of the Firth. So that's where the Skibo Road had to come. The Tongue Road started at Bonar Bridge and went up to Tongue. The Tane Road linked from the south coming there. And then we had the Fearn Road that was going over the Struy. There were bridges, lots of bridges to make in this area. One was on the special contract about Bonar Bridge, but others, Telford just let his contractors, whoever was doing it, he gave them general specifications. They had to build, and then he checked as they went. There were lots needed. The picture you're seeing there is not from here. That is from London, and it was a bridge being built there by Telford's rival Rennie, by John Rennie in 1819. And I put this on just to show you that building a masonry bridge still required an enormous amount of timber. You can see the structure that's being put in place as they try to then do the bridge over the Thames. Bonar Bridge itself was innovative. It was so unusual for the time. It was enormously expensive, £13,000. The reason why, again, was because of Mickle Ferry, and this was the way to have a bridge rather than have a ferry. Telford being ahead of his time, he basically, for this one and the Craigallachie Bridge, he had them made in Wales and shipped up in components and then assembled here. So it was very much of a modular system there. It was almost immediately seen as something extraordinary. It was a tourist attraction of the time. And Southey quotes somebody coming and looking at it, said it was like a spider's web in the air. It is the finest thing that ever was made by God or man. Other people would come. Southey quotes somebody who had never traveled since the Mickle Ferry disaster because he was so traumatized by it, but then came to look at Bonar Bridge. It had a good run, but it too was swept away in 1892 by some of the storms there. And we are now on our third Bonar Bridge. Easter Ferry Bridge on the Struy is a good example of a masonry, a type 3 masonry bridge. And the top bit here shows you the masonry construction with these spandrels coming there. This is the bridge here with the spandrels there. It's for years been published as a Telford bridge, but in fact it's not a Telford bridge. The archive work going through the commissioner's report showed that in 1839, the storm came and basically damaged it so much that it was almost completely rebuilt. It's a moot point though, is it a Telford bridge or not a Telford bridge, because they rebuilt it to exactly the same design. So it looks like that. We also found a completely unrecorded bridge that is probably Telford. It has exactly the same spandrel design there. This is at Altnafir na Mór. It's a bit south of Lairg Station. There's no documentary evidence on it. It was used until the 1990s, until it was bypassed. And so as part of the project, we did a complete survey of this and photographed it. which is probably just as well, because as you can see on this picture here, there's a lot of damage now. And as it's going and the storms are starting to eat in, and goodness knows, I think it's on borrowed time. We also found, I think, possibly another unrecorded bridge. We were quite excited by the road that was originally built, and this is one of the first roads that was built to link up with the little ferry, the ferry that was going to be there. And so this seemed to be an obvious opportunity to check for Telford bridges on a road that's been completely bypassed. It's still single track, very little work that's been done on it. So we followed it from the Trenton Arms all the way down to Little Ferry. And would you know, there's not one bridge along the entire way until you get just before the ferry, just about here. It's just typical of Telford that he designed his route so well that he would have the minimum amount of construction was needed. But when you go on this little bit here, as you're heading towards the Little Ferry crossing, there's this tiny bridge. There's a GPS unit for scale. And I think it shows you some of the examples of what some of the small masonry constructions would have been. There's also, we came across, when is a bridge and when is a bridge a culvert? This is one near Ardguy. It's enormously high, and yet the span is absolutely tiny. It's just that we have these deep ravines that had to be crossed. And so we have a lot of masonry construction that still survives. Telford was not the only one building bridges, and in fact, sometimes I think it was a catalyst. There was some places, for example, down in Bainoch and Strathspey, where local estate owners have been quite active in building bridges. Up here, a lot of the impetus, I think, was once Telford started building his bridges, building his routes, then the local council and even some landowners in some cases came on board and started building bridges as well. So we have here the Carron Bridge in 1818. It's being built while Telford is building the other routes. And so we have below the Shin Bridge, 1822, though Telford did advise on some of the plans. The Shin Bridge is in very poor condition as well. That's now bypassed. And as you can see from the vegetation, it's another one that's suffering in recent years. The Carron Bridge is still in use. So once roads were built, they then needed to have milestones. And these are not difficult to find because they're on the Land Ranger maps. You can look at them and they'll still list where milestones are. On the Sutherland side, they're all in this sort of shape. But Sutherland side, they're in concrete, and the Ross and Clomerty side, they're in stone. I think they're all much, much later than Telford, although we have documentary evidence of milestones being built. In part, the Sutherland certainly, because if you compare the first edition Ordnance Survey map with the Land Ranger now, you'll see that the milestones are listed in different locations. There is a Milestone Society. There's a website you can go on and you can track down and you can take your pictures and you can add information. It's something that goes countrywide. You also needed toll houses because these roads weren't free. The idea was that people would contribute to the costs. I think this is one of the reasons why the Nickel Ferry and the Little Ferry still kept going, because if you wanted to avoid the tolls, you could do that. Though having said that, the tolls were remarkably ineffectual. At Helmsdale, the toll keeper decided that he would get more money selling whiskey than he would collecting tolls, and so he didn't bother with the tolls. At Bonar Bridge, they went into a legal dispute, which in the end turned out that people just started using it. So we have toll houses used in some places. The example in the picture at the bottom right is from Tain. You can still see this as you go up the A9. It's right on the side. It's looking again a bit sad in recent times, just lots of construction materials near it. But you still have some of the toll houses surviving. And you needed coaching ends because, of course, now that you could travel, there was people using them. And so coaching inns were either expanded, as at Coleraine and Kincardine, or new inns built at Bonar Bridge, Clashmore, and Ardguy. This is where Southey really comes into his own because he liked to travel and he liked to eat. And he tells you about what he ate at lots of the places he went. Here we have Dined All Together at Kincardine, where we had an excellent pudding, which appears to be the legitimate cheesecake, the basis being fresh curd. I supposed it to be merely soft curd and currants baked. Bread is brought here from Inverness by the mail coach every day, for there is no yeast here, and the yeast in Inverness is obtained from the smugglers who make whiskey in the Black Isle. That yeast is thought better than any other. What a huge amount of information in one paragraph. It tells you so much about what's going on. But the parliamentary churches, these were designed, they were paid for by the government, though the landowners supplied the sites. 32 churches in the north, including the Western Isles, were built, and 41 manses built in the late 1820s. A budget was set of £1,500 for each. And in order to do this, Telford basically gave you plans. It was a kit. It was the IKEA of the time. You could have this church with just a few tweaks you could have, or you could have two types of manses to choose from. One was the single story, one was a double story. The standard church could seat 312, but galleries could be added in some cases as well. Because they were built to this plan, because they were built using, procuring materials from different places, if you see one Telford church, you now can recognize lots of the others. This is Croik Church, which is one of the smallest. It had seating only for 200. It's quite remote now. It came in under budget. The interior of Croik is well worth a look because it's one of the few that still has most of the furniture. The communion table is still there. The stove is still there. There's a lot of other information. And of course it has the window, the famous window, where people who were being cleared were scratching their names. The manse is just down the road. It's a holiday home. You can rent it if you like. As you can see, it's the single story. They opted to have the single story manse there. So what was the impact then of Telford? Well, he certainly improved the communication. There was no more need for the ferries. Roads could finally take the wheeled vehicles. We now saw that the mail coach from Inverness is coming. It's bringing bread. There's lots of opportunities. People were now starting to use it and to travel. There was also, it had employment and skills development, and Southey is very clear on this. He berates the government for having got all these people, this workforce that was skilled and could build roads, and not then moving them on to do more. He thought this a great waste. Some of this sounds oh so modern. And it led to new enterprise. For example, at Argyll, the pier now supported the export of wood, corn, wool, salmon, and imported meal, coal, and lime. And this is often the new statistical account, giving us an idea of what's happening. Bonar Bridge, before Telford, was just this ferry crossing, and it becomes a thriving village then. The picture we can see is from 1870, and it shows the original iron bridge there behind the ship. So it was a project that did a lot of research, that did a lot of on the ground. It created a trail leaflet, which is available from the Arch website and the History Links Archive website. There's binders of research that were deposited in libraries and at the Kyle of Sutherland Heritage Society. A display, again, at Kosh that can be loaned out. We did do some geocaches. We've not been very fortunate in this area. They've been vandalized, so I think most of them are getting pulled back now. Submitted a lot of new information into the HER. We have georeference maps available. So basically a good underpinning of putting Telford in the context of the time there. And so just a final thanks to the funders here who helped, the Robertson Trust and the local wind farm. A lot of help from the Highland Archive Centre and all the participants who helped on this as well. So thanks very much.